Okay, we're recording. So I'm Alim Ozcan covering John Mill's operating model as is to be slides. I will share my screen now. So here's the first slide that I would like to go through. And this relates to some of the questions that were asked on yesterday's session as well as to, well, what do we mean by an operating model? And for me, so the slides are, as you can see them on here, but for me, I normally focus on, when I define operating models, as the people, the processes, the tools, and then depending on the organization, sometimes I throw in governance there as well as part of the operating model. So for me, it's 4 key areas. Now, in addition, you'll see on the slide deck that we've got locations, we've got suppliers, etc. And of course, it is all the other supporting elements as well that all together provide the framework, the canvas for the operating model, as you can see here. Now, the reason I'm emphasizing this is because often in my experience, when I have been asked to work on an operating model or in terms of challenging what someone's perception of an operating model is, I find that they are only focused on processes or only focused on tools. And more often than not, they don't focus on the organization, the people, as an example. Whereas I think when you're looking at an operating model, it's the full canvas that you need to look at. So if we come to people as an example, the way I would do the as is to the to be model, so when I say as is, it would be assessing that organization and that people's capability in that organization. It might be in one department or one whole entire organization, so depending on where, what we're doing with the operating model and the work. It would be assessing it against the framework. Now, if that organization is using ITIL as an example, so if it's a BAU services area, I'd use the ITIL model to see, okay, so we need people accountable and responsible for change management, problem management, incident management, etc. So do we have that in the as-is model? So show me your organization, show me who's accountable, let me look at the job descriptions, etc., to understand what the as-is model looks like. And then based on the good practice, the best practice of ITIL, I would look at, well, what does ITIL suggest people do need? What processes, what roles, etc. And then I would just do a gap analysis as to, well, where are we now and what do we need to do to get to where we want to be. Okay, so that's the as is to be model when it comes from an ITIL perspective. But the same can apply in terms of project management. So if we're using Prince2 or PMI, what does the framework say we should have? Do we have all of these roles in place? PMs, the governance board, steering committees, whatever we need. And then, so what does the to be model look like and where's the gap? Okay, and I do that from a process perspective, a tools perspective. And when I mentioned governance earlier, for me, that's not only the kind of the stage gates and the authority, but also the reporting that we need. So what kind of reports do we have right now? So what's the as is, but what kind of reports do we need, either for the customer or for ourselves internally, and then where the gap is. In terms of the tools, so let me go on to that as well. I'm probably speaking too much about this slide, but hopefully you're finding it valuable. With regards to the tools, I tend to, at the very basic level, just use the Microsoft Office tool set. So it would be Word, Excel, PowerPoint to present my findings, Visio to do a diagram. So if I'm doing an organizational diagram, I'd use Visio to do a hierarchy, an organizational chart of the kind of current as-is people setup, and then of course the to-be setup. So anyway, so I've said quite a lot there. Hopefully some of that's resonated with you. Let me stop at that point to see if anyone has any questions on this slide or on anything I've said. Anyone?
I just want to point out the suppliers section on here. As we move into a world where, as a service is becoming, quite popular. So you're outsourcing a lot of the the responsibility for managing, infrastructure or applications, for example. I believe, the supply section or the partner section of this diagram is going to be key going forward, right? Ensuring that you have conversations early on with those suppliers, because at the end of the day, they're going to be an extension of your operating model.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I'm really glad you mentioned that, Anu, in that I think it's becoming even more prevalent, isn't it, with the way the world's changing, even this pandemic, that I think I've seen anyway, that organizations are trying to do far less internally in terms of, insourcing, and are using supplies more and more with, unified communications with technology, etc. So they play a key role, especially if the suppliers then, in this kind of situation that we're in right now, are struggling themselves to provide support to increase capacity, etc. So absolutely, I think that all has to become part of the operating model work someone needs to look at, right? And again, the as is to be concept can apply. So do an as is of the suppliers that you have on your books, and what kind of services they're providing, and then a to be of, well, what should it look like? So are you trying to consolidate suppliers? If you've got 20, 100, do you only want 5? Or do you actually want a more decentralized, diversified systems where you want more suppliers, so kind of more modular approach, because you don't want to rely on one supplier or 2 suppliers that potentially may not be able to fully support you in a situation like we're in now. But yeah, great point. Any others? Anything else from anyone, or do you want to touch on what Anu said?
If I just the one thing that kind of ties with what Anu was saying, and obviously what you were saying originally, is the RACI, which I'm surprised you didn't mention, actually, to be fair. But
yeah, we've done a lot of work on that, right? I'm glad you're bringing it up.
But as Alim was saying, in terms of that people process tools, the RACI is the bit that underpins the responsibility and accountability for that. So in that outsource or out task model, where you're looking at suppliers to do more, obviously more of that ownership or accountability and responsibility would sit there, but it would still sit within that process that Alim kind of highlighted in terms of the way that we build these things out.
Yeah, I'd agree with that, definitely. And I think, as an extension of that RACI, and also an extension of the to be in the governance layer, I think it reinforces the need for a strong SIAM capability within organizations. So you need somebody there who's going to take ownership of that service integration and management, to be able to play devil's advocate with the supplier, but also devil's advocate for and on behalf of the client as well. So having that strong SIAM layer there, I think, ensures that everybody's pulling in the same direction, and also it gives almost like a neutral playing field, so that concerns can be aired without resort to a Teflon shoulder blame culture sort of approach. So I think for me, that if we are going to devolve our supplier base, try and make ourselves more risk tolerant, then we're going to involve more suppliers. It takes a great level of management, but as a responsible organisation, be it internal or an external managed supplier, then or managed service, then we need to ensure that we have that appropriate level of governance in there to ensure that we're delivering along the right lines, and we shouldn't just be tied to what contracts say. So it's moving away from just pure supplier and vendor management to a more homogenous vehicle that everybody's going towards the same end business goal, to achieve that value, and that everybody recognises that by avoiding the blame culture and the shoulder slipping, that actually it can drive value not only for the client but for the suppliers as well.
Agreed. And just in case some people who are attending aren't familiar with SIAM, because I know it's a word that's often used, but if you've never looked into it, I won't bring it up now, but please do. It's spelled SIAM, SIAM. And I think it's great that you've mentioned it, because, Anthony, I think you raised it, because SIAM is often, I use it and I've seen it used as providing that tower model to identify what services you're providing, whether you're using internal, external, and yeah, that covers RACI and who's doing what. And it's a good governance overlay, and obviously involves in integrating the various systems, processes, people, etc. So yeah, I'm glad you mentioned it, but I don't have slides now to go into it in any detail. But please have a look at SIAM if you're not familiar with it yourselves.
Yeah, and on that as well, Ali, just to add to that, if anybody does have a particularly interest in SIAM and SIAM organisation, I've got a fair bit of collateral I'm more than happy to share on the channel for people. So just an intro or a more in-depth thing. So it's also something we'll follow up later on as well. Not a problem.
Yeah, great. So maybe just while I'm talking, Anthony, if you've got a good slide to be able to show that towards the end of this presentation, we can get you to share your screen so you can show it in a pictorial, just if people find that helpful. So yeah, if you have it planned, if you don't, then no worries.
I'll start digging right now.
Yeah, sorry to put you on the spot. Thank you.
No
so
worries.
Wikipedia will be good for that. But anyway, so let me ask to see if there's any other questions from anyone or any comments that people want to make. Okay, so I'll move us on. Just remember that you are, I think most of you are muted. So I hope you're not speaking to the microphone and assuming we can hear you when we can't. So unmute yourself if you do want to discuss something, or please use the chat function that is available to pose your question there, and we'll pick it up later. Okay, so I'll move us on for now. So I think around this, we have probably covered all of these points anyway, so I won't labor on it. One that I can see is mentioned here straight away that we should touch on and that I haven't covered yet is the measurement. So I mentioned reporting, but there's a saying, if you can't measure it, how can you improve it? Sayings like that. So I think, of course, that's absolutely key. Then any operating model work that you're doing, and that alongside with reporting, you have good measurement in place so that you can see if, for example, you do want to make an improvement and you're looking from the as-is perspective, as in, what do we have now and what does the panacea look like in terms of where we want to be, for you to be able to measure that improvement, as well as the BAU measurement that you'll be doing afterwards, outside of the project, outside of the improvement initiative that you're looking to achieve. There's a model called CMMI that I use. This is the 5-level maturity model, with level 1 being chaotic, ad hoc, and then level 5 being the most mature. Everything's working, I can close my eyes and everyone's working like how they're meant to be working. It's very rare to find an organization that's operating at level 5 for all of their different areas. But as I said, it's maybe a good objective to try and get to with those processes that you want to prioritize, or the people area, those reports that you want to prioritize. There'll be some that you want to get to level 5 maturity, and others that you'll be quite happy with being at, say, level 2 maturity or level 3 maturity, which is where it just works. There are issues, it's not perfect, but the kind of issues that we have, we then react and we resolve. Okay. So any questions around that from anyone, either in the chat or verbally, before I move on? Okay, let me keep going on then. I'm just skipping through these slides because we've covered a lot of this stuff. So you see we've talked about the as-is, we've talked about the to-be, the future state. And let me keep us moving through. So we've touched on this again, but I'll reference it here one more time. So again, one of the pitfalls that I've seen organizations or people face when they're looking at this big, huge, elephant that they're trying to think about in terms of, wow, this is our operating model. Where do I start? What do I do? It's huge. is to take it one bit at a time. And of course, it's easier said than done, but it's to prioritize those areas that you think needs to be focused on. And so the kind of model that I normally use is to have a brainstorming type of session, bring in all the key stakeholders over a day, over several days in workshops, identify all of those areas on the people, process, systems, governance, suppliers, etc., that we think makes up our operating model. So identify them all, list them down, list the areas we want to improve, and then either using a high, medium, low type prioritization model, just listing, okay, so what's priority for us, etc., so that you can really zone in on what you need to work on. And then, as was mentioned earlier, the RACI is so important in this as well as a tool, because you'd want to identify who's accountable. So, only one person for each area or for the whole thing, multiple people responsible, then who do you need to consult with, and who do you need to inform, will be key in your prioritization. So understand your customer, understand your business. Okay, so this was touched upon yesterday as well while we were covering this presentation, I think, the customer, and that's so key. So again, it differs for different organizations, but your customer can either be internal people, so another business unit, or of course, it could be your customer externally paying you for the service that you're providing. And then sometimes with the operating model work that you'll be doing, of course, you need to take into account both your own internal operating model of your organization, but perhaps the integration that you also need to do with your customer, and even areas that they need to change perhaps of their operating model, so that there's a synergy between the two. And as was mentioned earlier, the SIAM model is great for this, to show what they need to do, this other party, whether they're internal or external, and what you're doing, and how they click together. Okay, so let me stop there to see if there are questions on what I've just mentioned. Okay, let me move us on then. So we've covered many of these points. Okay, let me just, from this slide, let me just touch on the customer satisfaction then, surveys, the employee engagement that needs to be done as well. So again, this touches on measuring, and we said that earlier, but one area that I have seen organizations not do too well in when they're changing their operating models and understanding the as is and to be, is getting people involved early on. Okay, so getting them involved early on, making it clear what you're doing, various models you can use for this, certifications or courses that you can go on that help with business change are things like the APMG change management course, so the business change management course, as well as Prosky ACTA that some of you may have heard of. So in these courses, a lot of good tools as to how you identify the people that you want to engage with, how you prioritize them. So who are your champions? Who are your laggards, if you like, who are going to try and disrupt you? But either way, you have to deal with all the various types of people, because if you don't focus on them, someone somewhere will obviously throw a spanner in the works. So getting them involved early on, and then also doing regular customer satisfaction, and that could be through SurveyMonkey, or it could just be in workshops that you have now using online tools. It could be Slack, Microsoft Teams, etc. Just having continuous engagement with your audience is so key, because it's the one area I find that people just, especially if they're under tight deadlines, they cut corners on, and they'd rather just get on with the work, and it's quite hard dealing with people, so they kind of put that off. But actually that, I find, breaks what you're trying to do. So you have to get them involved earlier. I know I'm repeating myself, but it's so key. and a new person has just joined who I've admitted, so thank you for joining, and a couple of others. So let me just add some people in. Thanks, Abdul, for joining, and Anthony, I see you've rejoined. So I guess you had an issue. Okay, let me just move us on. So you can see the key points on the screen. I won't go through these because I want to get onto automation tools, as Anu had asked earlier. So I'm just going to keep going through this presentation. I think these are different levels you could use. So you can see here, what are your company values? What's company mission statement? Why do they exist? What is the strategic plan? So I think this is key as well, because again, when you're looking at operating model work, you should, of course, look at what your company's objectives are and what its strategy is, so that whatever you're looking to do is aligned with what your company is trying to achieve. So if they're trying to grow the business by 10%, 20%, or they're trying to expand or into a different geography, you know, in different area, different tools, then of course your operating model should be looking at how do you support that. By doing that and having the linkage to your company, your company values, I find it's also easier to then get the buy-in. So either the involvement from people, or if you need your sponsors putting money behind this, by linking it back to the business, it obviously helps with the justification and the authority to proceed, and the money if you more often than not need it. Okay, so key area for you to consider. So that's a summary of those bits. We've covered a lot of this. So you can see it's about manageable chunks. So start small, build up, communicate, 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 revise. So the continual service improvement. So we've achieved whatever we've achieved. How do we then revise what we're doing, steer our path slightly differently perhaps, and then execute, and then go round and round and round until you achieve the overall goals that you were looking you set out to do. So you see here, there's a start with why, but I think it's the 4 W's that you can use actually for any of this work again. And I know you'll be familiar with this, but I'll go over it. So it's why you're doing it, what you need to do, when, and how. And there may be a 5th W somewhere, but you know, they're the key ones that I remember off the top of my head. So of course, always ask the question, why are we doing it? Why? And actually, I should have mentioned on the earlier slide as well that I'll mention now, when we look at the business and linking back to the business, and we touched on it earlier before the recording started, and that's the business continuity. So the operating model, of course, should take into account business continuity. Now, no one would have foreseen the pandemic that we're in lockdown now, etc. But there were organizations that obviously thought a much smaller level, and then looked at their operating models from the perspective of, if something happens, if this disaster recovery business continuity situation happens, how would we adapt, or what do we need to change in our operating model right now to ensure that we're ready for that thing that could happen in a year's time. Also, actually, I haven't mentioned, we should look at our competitors, right? So our competitors could either be internal or external, but if we are trying to get ahead of our competitors, be the best, improve our operating model, then of course we should look at how they do their business, how they automate, what they're achieving, and looking at how we can do our operating model more efficiently or more effectively, so that of course we can be more competitive and ahead of the game. I won't talk about this slide, but I'll stop here just to see if there are any other questions or points that anyone wants to raise.
Hi, Alim. I just want to share a thought. So I think traditionally, yes, the idea is to put in place your operating model and think about how you will work into the next 2-3 years according to your company's business plan and vision. though this pandemic has brought about a need for companies to instantly review their operating models and adapt their industries, and even we found car manufacturers making ventilators. We found alcohol companies starting to make hand sanitizers. So they had to instantly saw this need and adapted to the situation. So traditionally, yes, you would do this, but there is times where you may at any point in time as a company review your operating model.
Yeah, I agree. And thanks for that. So absolutely, completely agree. Any other thoughts? Okay, just on the point that Nilisha was making, so a lot of the work I do is based around ITIL, and one of the processes in there is the continual service improvement process. So if you are involved in that process, or your organization's using that process, it's a BAU process. It's not a project. It's not something that we do once every year, or once every 2 years. It's a process that looks, as the name suggests, and I know some of you will be familiar with, a continual service improvement on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis as an internal BAU improvement function. So if your operating model type work is not part of that process, I think it needs to be. Or if, for example, it is part of that process, so you're involved, or you're seeing it from afar, and there is a CSI process, then I would say, I'd hope that many of the aspects that we've covered in this presentation, such as looking at your competitors, various stuff, pandemics, business continuity, etc., should actually be part of that CSI process. The different levels of maturity, so level 1 to 5, and yeah, I won't repeat it all, but many aspects that we've covered should form part of your overall process and should be looked at actually on a day-to-day or week-to-week basis, as well as then doing a big, perhaps, project every now and then to look at the whole operating model, I guess, on a more project, more focused basis with resources. And often where that's driven from is automation, which we'll cover as well afterwards. Okay, let me move us on. So there's a couple of things here, a couple of tools that I'll mention. Again, many of you will be familiar with, but SMART goals. I can't remember if I'll get the terminology exactly right, but strategic, measurable, achievable, realistic, and targeted. So there's one tool that you may use to look at the operating model. And then we've mentioned doing a gap analysis. Sorry, let me just go back or forward. I'm not sure what happened there. Give me a second. SWOT, looking at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And again, that model could be used for, depending on what the scenario is. And PESTLE here, I can't remember if it's political, environmental. Yes, don't test me on the others. But so a number of models that you can use in doing this work, this improvement work. So let me move us on. Okay, let me keep going. So I didn't have to remember them off head, they're here. Let me just keep going on because I think we've covered a lot of this. So let me just keep moving us on. I think we are nearing the end now.
I think, Ali, one thing to add to what you were saying just before there about the people, the technology, innovation, and what Nilisha was saying as well, is that we need to make sure that our people feel empowered enough to offer suggestions for improvement without any fear of being castigated or put down for it. And if they've got a good idea for improving something, then we should almost allow them the room to try it out and potentially to fail as well, because it's only through failure that we actually get true innovation and advancement. And that's something I think is, there's a lot of places, even the place I worked at last time when it was in Edinburgh, the CSI, they had a CSI process, they had a CSI manager, but they had a CSI log that was only reviewed every 6 months. Well, that's not continuous, that's periodic. Yeah, and it was done by the ELT, by the extended leadership team. The suggestions were put on there by the staff, but the priority was decided by the ELT.
Yeah,
and that's not really in the right spirit of it. I don't think. We need that. You say, oh, you've got a good idea, great. Here's some time. Here's some resources. Here's some cash. Go and explore it. Give it a try. Come back to us and tell us what you have found out, be it positive or negative, and then we can use that as a baseline for advanced learnings and moving forwards, perhaps. It's about empowerment, I think, is really important. Sometimes a lot of organisations don't perhaps give it that enough focus.
That's right. I completely agree. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I think you're right there, Anthony. CSI. I've had experiences where it's just been implemented just because it's a buzzword, right? Right, we're doing CSI, but like you say, it's just periodic. There's just a CSI log, and there's no real commitment there, like in terms of budget, right? I think more importantly than anything, to actually try and improve things and look. I touched upon it before, like bimodal IT, right? And basically, it's a Gartner operating model that they've I think it's a couple of years old that they've talked about, and what they talk about is so bimodal is BI and MODAL, and what they talk about is having two modes of operating in your organization. So you have a mode 1, which focuses on the core business, core services, but then you have a mode 2 where you're looking at innovation, you're looking at utilizing these brand spanking new tools which has promised efficiencies, but you need to work really hard and really smart to get the value out of them, because you've sort of changed the way your employees are working when you're bringing in technologies such as like software defined networking, for example, right? You're asking network engineers who were doing 70% of manual tasks previously to now be essentially software developers and try and automate those tasks, right? So look, I just want to touch upon that point. I think there needs to be a real commitment, not just from a budgetary perspective, but also the way you're working to allow for innovation and the room to fail, like you say, right? To try and get the value out of these capabilities, and try and make it work. Because if there isn't, then then nothing happens, right? Sorry, my monitor just went. So nothing happens. Like and it's they're just capabilities that are just sitting there that are running at, say, 10%. That what it can actually do.
Yeah. I think so. Look, I'll give other people a chance to ask questions and speak, but just on what's been said. So, in my experience here, often operating models are looked at for two big reasons. One is if there's a major incident, if there's a problem, something's gone wrong, and we have to react, right? And then obviously the MD or whoever says, right, this needs to change, and everyone runs at it at 100 miles per hour, and then it has some momentum for a while. So that's one reason. The other is if there is a change in leadership. So either in the department or the organization, and the new person, the new leader wants things done differently and improvement, wants to stamp their authority. But I completely agree, it should just be done actually as a BAU type function rather than reacting, right? It should be ongoing. But yeah, that's obviously, look, this session is about advocating good practice, what as is and to be is, operating models, and so we know that there's all kinds of issues there, and it keeps me busy and keeps me in work. So maybe it's great that people people don't do as BAU. But anyway, other thoughts or questions from anyone? Okay, if you're on mute, remember to unmute yourself if you do have a question. Let's talk with the few minutes that we have left then on some automation tools. So I think the key thing I'd want to say here is that if you are, and there's many tools there, so I can't go over all the tools, but we'll mention some. I think the key thing is, if you are going to make a change to your operating model, for it to stick and for it to therefore be embedded in that operating model or that new way of working and to be used, it more often than not needs to be scripted, needs to be automated. Because if it's too difficult for a person or too costly for a person or a team of people to action that change, then either they're going to make mistakes in it and therefore it's not going to meet the objectives potentially, or at some point after the momentum is gone, they're going to go back to the old ways of working. So where you can automate, where you can script, absolutely. And whether the script is done from using, I don't know, programming language like Python, and it achieves something that you had to do manually in an automated way by clicking a button and it does it for you, or whether you use a tool to automate, I don't know, your service desk calls, your scripts, your chatbots using ServiceNow, whatever other tools are out there, it should be used. Also, I mentioned Slack and Teams. I think that what's the word? That timely communication that you can have with people. So you're not waiting to try and book a meeting with them, speak to them potentially in a day's time or when they're available. Being able to chat with people straight away, agree something, get something done, is so key in this kind of modern world that we are going towards. Other tools, so that no one thinks that I'm a ServiceNow representative and that I'm making money off them. Other tools that exist are BMC Remedy. They have a great workflow engine. Freshworks is one that I've come across recently. So these are good service management tools. In terms of perhaps project management and what other people are used to, well, even some functions in this is probably not what really gives a good view of operating models, but let's just talk about project management. Some of the new tools like Trello, of course, the older tools like MS Project also help automate some of the functions that people are working on in terms of having boards, what they're doing. Now, you may have to move it across manually, but at least it's visual, it's there, it's something that the whole team can work together. And you can even define your operating model in Trello, for example, in some of these other tools that exist, right? So too many tools out there, depending on what your requirements are. So any other questions or thoughts before we wrap up? Okay, so I hope you found that beneficial. I hope I stood in for John Mills as best as I could. And I look forward to seeing some of you on the next session starting in about half an hour. Have a good day and speak soon.
Thanks, Alim. Cheers, everyone.
Cheers, guys.
Yeah,
Cheers,
thank you
much,
very
guys.
much. Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.